Have you ever wondered what would happen if superheroes aged in real time? That's the question that writer John Byrne wanted to answer through his comic Superman Batman Generations, a little-known comic from the Elseworlds line that tells us the story and legacy of the Wayne and Kent families through several generations. The comic is divided into 8 chapters where each story is separated by a period of 10 years, which gives us the opportunity to witness major events in the lives of these families. From the birth of Clark Wayne, the grandson of Superman, who was raised by Batman's son, to the death of Kara Kent. The events of the comic are not always the happiest because the idea of this story is to present these families as any other, where there are some periods of happiness and others of suffering, something that is normal over time. Not only that, but the comic also emulates the writing style that was had in each era, from the funny science fiction stories of the 50s to the so-called grim and gritty of the 80s, an era known for having particularly dark stories with political overtones. Generations is a great experiment and one of the best comics I've read in my life. It's not just a story about Superman and Batman and the characters around them, but it's a story about the history of comics. In this video, I'll share the full story of Generations. We're going to analyze these winks and references to the real world and the resources that John Byrne used to create this gem. Today, we will take the Wayne and Kent families very seriously. This is Go, the Geek Monitor speaking. The inspiration for this comic came from the Marvel character Captain America. Well, technically from a crossover between Batman and Captain America. In 1997, John Byrne wrote a comic where Batman, Robin, Captain America, and Bucky joined forces to stop Joker and Red Skull. This tale occurred in 1945 near the conclusion of World War II in a world where, for some unknown reason, Batman and Captain America existed together. There are no jumps between universes. This is simply how this world is. As in every classic superhero story, Batman and Captain defeat their adversaries, but there are a few interesting details about this comic. One of them is that Joker initially didn't know he was allying with a Nazi, and upon finding out, he tells Red Skull, "I may be a lunatic criminal, but I'm an American lunatic criminal. Step aside, this phenomenon is mine." The other interesting detail is that at the end of this story, it is Batman himself who discovers Captain America frozen 20 years later. However, this Batman is no longer Bruce Wayne, but Dick Grayson, and Robin is a new character named Bruce Wayne Jr. And in the last panel, we can see Steve Rogers, Dick Grayson, Bruce Wayne, and his son Bruce Wayne Jr. in the same comic, John Byrne. Thanks writer Roger Stern for giving him the idea for this ending. And in this last panel, we see 3 generations of Batman, which became the idea behind Generations. One of the central points of this comic then is to show us what would happen if the passage of time worked the same way in comics as it does in real life and how this concept could affect these characters. Have you heard of the floating timeline? Time works differently in comics. Years pass, but superheroes remain eternally young. They live in an infinite continuous present that adapts stories to the current era using a floating timeline. The world they inhabit changes, but the characters remain static. This floating timeline concept is not exclusive to comics. A clear example of this in fiction can be found in The Simpsons, a cartoon airing for over 30 years. On one hand, we see Maggie as an eternal baby, while simultaneously Springfield goes from watching antenna television to using cell phones and modern devices in recent episodes. The central idea of this concept then is to allow the characters to live in a permanently current world without suffering the ravages of time. Better than the hyaluronic acid creams your mom uses. Aren't they the same creams that you use? The other central point of this comic is to portray each era according to the writing style that was used in those years. That's why some chapters feel so different from others. Finally, it should be noted that the story has several continuity errors that were put there on purpose. An example is that Superman couldn't fly in 1939, but in a later comic flashback, Superboy is seen flying in 1929. Why does this happen? Well, because that's how it happened in the original comics. That is, Superman couldn't fly in his early comics. From 1938, but years later, when the Superboy comic was introduced, he had all his powers. The idea then was that we would experience continuity in the same way that readers did in those years, a concept that I find very, very interesting. But now that we have context on how it's written, this comic, let's go straight into the story. The first issue begins in 1939. Superman and Batman meet for the first time at the Metropolis World Fair. Here we see a young Bruce Wayne doing his millionaire playboy routine, landing his plane in the middle of the fair when a giant robot appears to destroy it. Luckily, Superman quickly neutralizes the malfunctioning robot, and the incident is blamed on the robot's malfunction. However, Batman doubts this and investigates. In this part of the story, he was referred to as the Batman, which was his name during that time period. The comic then tells us that the villain behind the attack was none other than Ultra Humanite, who has a mysterious red-haired henchman whom he calls 50. Soon after, while investigating at the fair, Batman encounters Lois Lane and Clark Kent, who also suspect something unusual about the situation. Louis finds a clue and the Batman takes it out of his hands, something that doesn't sit well with Clark Kent, who is about to attack the Dark Knight only to be knocked out with a blow to the back of the head. Clark wasn't hurt, but he pretended to be to avoid suspicion. Even so, it's very hard to fool the world's best detective. Batman leaves the scene, suspecting there's more to Clark Kent than just being a reporter. "Keep pretending, Kent, but I'm going to keep an eye on you. You fell too easily, but hitting your neck was like hitting a steel beam." Shortly after, Louis Delane and Bruce Wayne are ambushed by henchmen of Ultra Humanite, but they escape with the help of young Dick Grayson, and later the Batman and Superman team up for the first time to interrogate a suspect who gives them the location of Ultra Humanite's lair. The villain, despite his great intelligence, can't stand against two heroes together and decides to escape in a ship only to be stopped by Superman, who blows up the ship with Ultra inside. This first issue contains many interesting things. The first thing is that Superman and the Batman are wearing the costumes they used in those times. Not only that, but Superman is presented with these slanted eyes as if he always had his eyes closed just as he appeared in his first comics. Another interesting point is that the heroes face Ultra Humanite, who was the first supervillain Superman ever faced. Let's say he was the original Lex Luthor, that is, a bald villain who had super intelligence but who was later relegated to the background when Lex Luthor gained popularity. Finally, there's the morality of these stories. Here we see how Batman unhesitatingly throws a thief from a very high place. Batman was saved by Superman, but in those times he did kill some criminals. Superman's early days also lacked the no-killing rule, as seen in this comic where he destroys Ultra Humanite's rocket with him inside. But my favorite nod is that the story is set at the Metropolis World Fair. Why? Well, because the first time Superman and Batman shared a cover was in this comic from the New York World Fair. In this issue, Lex Luthor and Joker team up to kidnap Lois Lane, who is about to have Superman's first child, in order to lure the Man of Steel into a kryptonite trap. As expected, Batman and Robin help Superman with this situation, but something interesting is that this case is presented as Robin's last since Dick Grayson is about to go to college to study law. That is, in a few panels we are told that many things have changed in these last 10 years. Superman and Batman are now friends with new suits. Dick Grayson is an adult, Commissioner Gordon has retired, and Superman and Lois are married. Superman, Batman, and Robin managed to defeat the villains and save Lois Lane by swapping their costumes so that Batman could approach Lois without fear of kryptonite. Lex Luthor and Joker apparently die in an explosion, but unfortunately Lois Lane does not escape unscathed, as Superman discovers that Luthor exposed her to the so-called Golden Kryptonite, an alternate version of kryptonite that has the ability to permanently remove a Kryptonian's powers, in this case Superman's son, Joel Kent, who was still in his mother's womb. The comic ends with Superman and Lois deciding that it's best to hide from their son that his father is Superman, and with Bruce Wayne's wife announcing that she is pregnant. An interesting fact is that the comic never tells us who Bruce Wayne's wife is. We only know that it is neither Selina Kyle nor Talia al Ghul from fragments of the story. Another thing to clarify is that, according to the comic, Superman and Lois think that growing up without powers will be a very big burden for their son Joel, so they decide to hide from him that his father is Superman, and this will obviously have very big repercussions in the future. 10 years later, in 1959, we see Superman and Batman on an adventure with a more comic tone, where they have to face Batmite and Mr. Mistplk, who made a bet to see which of the two heroes was the strongest, so Batmite decided to attack Superman and Mr. Mistplk to Batman. I say that just because I took the time to pronounce Mr. Mistplk correctly, you should consider subscribing to my channel. I say. The center of this story derives directly from the Silver Age comics where Superman and Batman lived very comic adventures. But it also tells us parts of the long story arc of this comic, the history and legacy of the Wayne and Kent families. In this issue, we are told that Clark and Lois already have a second daughter named Kara, who begins to develop superpowers and has to use a gem that mimics the radiation of a red sun to lead a normal life. We also see that Bruce Jr., or BJ as they call him, is eager to become the new Robin, and Dick Grayson returning to Gotham City after many years with the intention of taking up the Batmantle as Bruce Wayne is beginning to age. This issue ends with Superman and Batman obviously deceiving their adversaries and defeating them, and with Lex Luthor approaching Joel Kent with the intention of telling him a secret. 10 years later, in 1969, things start to get darker and more political for the families. This comic begins with President Nixon asking the new Justice League to go to Vietnam to end the war. However, the League opposes this because, in Superman's words, "This is not that easy, this is not World War II." The bad guys aren't so clearly defined. When the heroes leave the Oval Office, the new Batman, Dick Grayson, asks Clark if he has heard anything from his son Joel, who is fighting in the war. Clark says he hasn't heard from him in 2 weeks and can't look for him as promised, not to interfere with his military career. Lex Luthor told Joel the truth about his father's powers, without revealing that he was the one who took them away. Luthor begins to manipulate Joel, fueling his growing resentment towards Superman. Shortly after, the comic shows us that Joel's battalion is still alive, but portrays Joel as a violent character who always seems to want to prove something to himself, even if he has to hit women and the elderly to do it. They betray him, as they believe his actions have gone too far. Things don't look much better for Lois Lane, who just found out she has cancer and only has a few years left to live. Clark and Kara have tried searching the galaxy for a cure for this disease, but they haven't been able to find one that works on human physiology. The main plot of this comic focuses on Batman. Dick Grayson and Bruce Wayne Jr., the new Batman and Robin, begin to investigate a new criminal who calls himself Joker Jr., who seems to have all the tricks of the old Joker, who is in prison and denies knowing this new criminal or having anything to do with him. The clues indicate Joker Jr.'s plan to steal diamonds from a building. Batman investigates while Robin questions the old Joker further. However, to his surprise, Joker is not in his cell, and the only thing Robin discovers is a passage that Joker has been using to enter and exit his cell at will, so he deduces that Batman is in serious trouble. In other words, Joker Jr. never existed. It was always the original Joker who took years to set up this whole trap. When Batman arrives to investigate the building, he quickly falls into a passageway with blades that cut his suit, which are impregnated with a mix of chemicals that disorient him. Batman and Joker fight for the last time, but the Dark Knight is no match for the Clown Prince of Crime in this state. When Robin arrives, he realizes that his friend and mentor is dead, and Joker easily surrenders to the authorities, saying, "I'm the man who killed Batman." However, Bruce Wayne Jr. decides to keep alive the idea that there has only been one Batman and tells the authorities that Joker didn't kill Batman, but he actually killed Robin. The comic ends with the funeral of Dick Grayson, and with Clark and Lois receiving the news that their son Joel had died in Vietnam. However, it's comics, and we're told that Joel didn't actually die and was saved by Lex Luthor. The next issue, set in 1979, opens with the major announcement that Bruce Wayne and Kara Kent, known as Batman and Supergirl, are on the verge of getting married. Life has hit the Wayne and Kent families hard in these last 10 years, but they are willing to see this marriage as the beginning of a new era for everyone. Lois Lane is alive as her doctor has kept her cancer in remission. Despite her fragile health, she's eager to see her daughter get married. Clark, on the other hand, has to apply makeup in such a way that he appears older, as he is now the editor of the Daily Planet, but he is still Superman. Kara Kent and Bruce Wayne Jr. now form a great team, easily defeating villains like Brainiac. Everything seems to be going well for both families, despite there being no signs of Bruce Wayne, who embarked on a mission to discover Ra's al Ghul's secret lair. We will see what happens with Ra's al Ghul and Bruce later. The wedding between Bruce and Kara was set, ready to unite the two greatest superhero families at last. Clark and Louise were very proud of their daughter, and there was an atmosphere of happiness and hope. However, a mysterious figure arrived and attacked Clark with an intense kryptonite beam, leaving him incapacitated. Kara and Bruce Jr. pursued the mysterious villain. Kara and Bruce Jr. went after the mysterious villain, assuming it was Lex Luthor, but they didn't realize that Clark, Louis, and his doctor, who was treating him for cancer, were trapped inside a force field. The doctor turned out to be Lex Luthor, who killed Lois Lane without Clark being able to do anything to save her, and told the Man of Steel that today he would see his entire family die. Kara, for her part, faced the mysterious villain only to realize that it was her lost brother Joel, who now had powers and was on the side of ex-Luthor. Supergirl was killed by her brother in a fierce battle, and Bruce Jr. discovered her body. Superman, having recovered from kryptonite, found Luthor and Joel, who also perished from the power-granting formula, fulfilling Luthor's vow to Clark that he would witness his family's demise that day. The comic ends with Superman and Batman finding Joel's son, who also has no powers, so Batman decides to raise him as his own. In his words, "We both lost everything this day, everything that matters." However, in this child perhaps we have been given something, a second chance. In this child perhaps we can build the true union of our families and have faith in a better tomorrow. This comic shows Superman suffering more than I've ever seen. Byron's exaggeration was intentional to showcase the characteristics of each comic era. This was the era when superheroes began experiencing more losses. Another very interesting point is that this chapter is called The Twilight of the Gods, which is the same name the story that was never published had, by Alan Moore, which also dealt with the union between two of the biggest families in DC Comics. I have a complete video in which I narrate the story. I'll leave it here for you. In the following issue, which took place in 1989, we are told that Superman finally found Luthor after searching for him for 10 years. Luthor manages to trap Superman and take away his powers using gold kryptonite, but the Man of Steel manages to escape, accidentally killing Luthor in the process, not before realizing that the real villain behind all his suffering was not Lex Luthor, but Ultra Humanite. One of Ultra Humanite's most characteristic traits is his ability to transfer his brain to other bodies. So we are told that Ultra transferred his brain to the former Luthor's body when they both exploded the rocket in 1939. Batman, now donning a high-tech 90s style suit, is tasked with apprehending Superman for Luthor's murder. However, Clark chooses to voluntarily surrender and plead guilty to the authorities. Batman doesn't understand this situation as it was all in self-defense, but Superman tells him, "Years ago I swore not to kill, and I have honored this oath for most of my life, but I hated Luthor. I hated what he had done to me and my family. I can't be sure that it wasn't my hatred that guided my hand at the last moment." The jury accepted his answer, but gave him a reduced sentence for his services to humanity. 10 years in the Phantom Zone. The issue ends with Batman activating the projector and Superman saying, "I hope in 10 years you've made the world a better place." In the next issue, set in 1999, we finally discover the fate of Bruce Wayne, who has been missing for 20 years. This comic begins with Batman imprisoned in Ra's al Ghul's lair. However, to his surprise, it is Bruce Wayne himself, his father, who is in charge of everything since 10 years ago he entered the Lazarus Pit with Ra's, defeated him and took over his organization, which he has now gradually and without Batman realizing it, turned into an agency that helps people in need. So Rachel Gould had died, Bruce Wayne was now immortal and wanted to leave his son in charge of the entire organization for the simplest reason in the world. He wanted to be Batman again. Upon returning to the role, he first rescues Clark from the Phantom Zone and meets Clark Wayne, the 20-year-old Nightwing, for the first time. Clark Wayne, Nightwing, who is now 20 years old and had had a lot of time to think within the Phantom Zone, and deduced that the former Luthor, or well, Ultra, had found a way to return his powers, since his intention was to switch bodies with him and, well, a Kryptonian body without powers is of no use, right? Batman and Superman traveled to Ultra's old fortress and found the cure for the golden kryptonite, which returned Superman and even Nightwing their powers. The comic ends with Superman leaving life on Earth behind and heading into space to be able to help more people, as he can now be at ease knowing there are people who will take care of Earth for him. The final issue is set 9 centuries later. The final issue serves as a kind of epilogue where Bruce Wayne and Clark Kent meet to recall an adventure they had against the original Lex Luthor before their encounter at the Metropolis World Fair. Here we are told that both Superman and Batman are aging more slowly, so they decide to explore the galaxy together with the intention of defending those who are unable to defend themselves. This issue closes with Clark, Bruce and Lana Lang, who had also become immortal after a spell, smiling towards the future and embarking on what seems to be an endless fight for justice. However, years later, John Byrne revisited these stories through the sequels titled Generations 2 and 3, where we are told about some events that occurred during those time lapses that were not covered by the original comic, like that story where Dick Grayson returns as a ghost to avenge Joker, and one of my favorites where we are told that Bruce Wayne's parents knew they were going to die in that alley and decided to do it because they knew their son would eventually become Batman. This is one of the first comics I bought and I hold it very dear. But what I like is that the more stories I read, the more I valued this one. It's definitely in my top 10 comics. This is not just an interesting experiment of what would happen if superheroes aged. What I like most is that it's a story that talks about the history of superheroes and does so in such a way that it uses two of its most iconic characters to show us how the comic medium was evolving and how its narrative was changing. Superman and Batman are my favorites, so I wanted to kick off 2023 by discussing them. If you enjoy these videos, I'll share some more on the topic with you. That's all for today. I'm Go, and keep looking beyond the obvious. Thank you.